I'm going to give a fairly wide-ranging talk, and the purpose of giving a wide-ranging talk is because I'm the opening talk, but also because sometimes it's helpful at the beginning to have something which is less in-depth, but covers a wide area so that it can stimulate syntheses later on as people try to put together some of the details that emerge in a conference into a set of common themes. I have to do the first thing, the prerequisite, which is to tell you where my funding is from. A bunch of different places over the years. And in this talk, I'm going to have two parts. And I'm noticing already a typographical error that the second part is number one here, and as is the first part. My apologies for that. But it's going to be in two parts. The first part to talk about the construction of autism as a concept for understanding variability among children. And the second is to look at the role of culture in particular experiences of autism, say in a particular population, in a particular city, or even the experience of autism as it emerges in a church recreation room or in a schoolyard. So let me begin here with part one by talking about an experience that I had recently. I was in a very busy, crowded, noisy room, and I heard a voice behind me. And the voice said, "All right, Sparky, here's the deal. You want to court the little lady, you got to be a straight shooter. You follow me?" When I turned around, I saw a boy, maybe 13 years old, continuing on with what is the script from the Disney movie Aladdin. And like many parents, I've seen that movie too many times, and he had his fingers in his ears. The repetition of words and phrases from movies was not new to me. I've seen many people with autism repeat lines from Disney movies, including my own daughter. I've seen many people put their fingers in their ears, including my own daughter. What was startling to me was the location. I was standing in an emergency room at an antiretroviral clinic in rural KwaZulu-Natal, and this boy was waiting for his mother. The point that I'm trying to make is that autism, or at least what we call autism today, exists everywhere. We've not always called it autism, and the meanings of the word itself change over time and according to context. So suppose I say that autism is a mid to late 20th century construction. Suppose I say it's a mid to late 20th century construction that is historically contingent, that it is a historically contingent assemblage of behaviors selected from an almost infinite array of behaviors. Now, by saying this, by treating autism as a construction, I don't mean that the phenomena of autism don't exist or they're a figment of our imagination. This approach, or a constructivist approach, if you will, does not deny that there is an underlying condition that can produce suffering, but it acknowledges that our models of those conditions are dependent on our history and our culture, and that in the words of the medical anthropologist Paul Brodwin, our models typically race ahead of what is actually known, reclassify knowledge through educated guesses and grand syntheses, and justify the practices that surround identification and treatment. Many of you will likely not have heard an anthropologist talk about autism before, and you may associate autism with somebody like Margaret Mead, pictured here in traditional Samoan dress in the South Pacific, and we think of anthropology as the study of exotic peoples. In fact, I spent 2 years living with the Pygmies in the northeastern Democratic Republic of Congo. But ideally, what anthropology is about is not just understanding others, but it is understanding others in order to return changed to ourselves and to see ourselves in a new light. For Margaret Mead, understanding culture was about showing that things we believed were in nature, or that we took for granted, in her case, that there was such a thing called adolescence and that it was necessarily a time of stress or strain, were products of culture. And that the way we do things, whether it's how we divide up to do the division of labor of sexes, or how we think about how we should raise our children, or whatever it might be, that these things are not fixed in nature. They're not, the way we do things is not the only way, and it's not the right way. And one way that anthropologists think about this relationship between nature and culture is through metaphor. One of the best, suggested by an anthropologist named Marshall Solomons, is that nature is like a piece of marble. Maybe a piece of marble found somewhere in northern Italy, in Tuscany. And it's made by nature. It is what it is. There's only so much you can do with it. It has its limits, but it also has its capabilities. But it is culture that determines whether that slab of marble becomes Michelangelo's David, or a column in a temple, or a monument to a great leader, or a cemetery stone. And lest you think, well, that product of this marble was prefigured by what you can do with it or what you can't do with it. There was something in the human being who selected that slab of marble, who saw in it the latent image of his own project. So culture is about how we give meaning to nature. We all have to eat to survive. But how we eat, what we eat, when we eat, with whom we eat, these are all the products of culture. We have to engage in social communication to survive. Most of us have hearing. Most of us have fine motor control and language that helps us in social interaction. But how we structure the interactions, how we structure the practices and the meanings will vary widely, as will our definitions of what constitutes normal or abnormal behavior or social communication. There's another aspect of culture to consider. Not just how we're different or similar from each other, but also the cultures of science and knowledge, more generally. Because when we speak of autism, we always think that we're talking about this phenomenon that really exists. What really exists is not autism. It's a child with problems, challenges, and also sometimes great strengths and skills. My daughter will have issues with social communication, repetitive and stereotype behaviors, no matter what we call her. So we often think we're talking about the phenomenon when in fact we're talking about the context in which we've decided to frame something in those terms. The philosopher Jacques Derrida frames it by saying that we often talk about that of which we speak as opposed to that out of which we speak. And so while one might assume that an anthropologist would perhaps come and say, well, in South Asian cultures people think this, and in Japanese cultures people think this, in South Korea people think that, one of the most valuable things that an anthropological perspective can do is not just to show us how culture affects autism, but also to unmask the cultural foundations of its representations, including advocacy, education, and science. Culture is not just about other people, it's also about ourselves, and there's as much culture in this conference room as there is in a village in the African rainforest.